Hi, everyone. This is your friendly Episcopal priest and rector of Trinity Episcopal Church in Bloomington, Indiana, Matt Seddon. And this presentation is on the birth and history of the Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church. This presentation is designed to be part of our class for newcomers, as well as one of our classes for people who wish to be confirmed or received into the Episcopal Church, or just for people who want to learn more about the Episcopal Church and the church that it comes from. So I hope you enjoy this overview and that it helps you understand a little bit better about who we are and how we got to be this way. Now, the way I like to start is to start by saying that we are, in fact, a Protestant church. We are a Reformed church. But if you have been in a service in Trinity Episcopal Church or in any other Episcopal or Anglican church, you'll notice that we're a strange looking set of Protestants. So right in the middle there, that middle image is from Trinity Episcopal Church here in Bloomington. To the left is an image from what I would call a fairly typical Roman Catholic church. This one happens to be in Mexico. And to the right is an image of what I would call a fairly typical and kind of classic Protestant church, like a Baptist church or a Presbyterian church or something like that. And right away, you notice some differences. You notice that the Episcopal Church in the middle has an altar front and center, but it like the Roman Catholic Church on the left, but it just doesn't have as much decoration, quite as much many statues, as much imagery of the Virgin Mary as you have in the Roman Catholic Church. However, it does have more imagery and things than the Protestant church. So we are kind of strange looking. How do we wind up looking the way that we do? Also, if you come into one of our churches, you'll notice that there is a lot of variation between people in how we worship, and in particular, the kind of personal piety that we might express. You'll see some people crossing themselves at different points in the service. You will see others not crossing themselves. You will see people kneeling at certain points in the service and other people just standing or sitting. You will see all kinds of ways that we celebrate together. And even if you go to different Episcopal churches, you will see variations in that. So that's interesting. A lot of churches are more uniform in what people are doing and when they're doing it. We also embrace a lot of theological diversity. So if you wind up talking to people, you'll hear and asking questions, you'll hear a lot of different answers about things like, hey, is the bread and wine actually Jesus's body and blood in what's called real presence? Or is it just something that we use to remember Jesus's Last Supper? Hey, do you guys venerate the Blessed Virgin Mary or not? Well, actually, you'll see diversity in that. What's your doctrine besides having the creeds? And actually, you'll get a lot of different answers to that. We don't have a single doctrine of things like sin or salvation or heaven and hell. We have lots of variation in what we think about that. And we even have various different ways in which people read and understand the Bible. We have churches that are welcoming of LGBTQIA plus folks and places that aren't. We have places where women are ordained. In fact, the vast majority of places women are ordained, but we also have places where they're not. So lots of diversity in worship, lots of diversity in practices, lots of theological diversity. So, how did we get here? It makes me think of the Talking Heads song, Once in a Lifetime. How did I get here? How did we end up here? Well, you have to look at our history to figure that out because we have a pretty unique history. Now, most people, when they start thinking about the birth of the Church of England, which is our parent church, our mother church, they'll start thinking, or the English Reformation, sometimes it's called, they'll start thinking about Henry VIII. And him wanting a divorce is what's commonly understood. What it actually was an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. But actually, it's not all due to Hank. but in a way, a lot of it is, but usually not in the way people think. It's not just all about a divorce or an annulment. So let's get into that. But first, we have to back up and we have to look at the total religious context of what was going on in Europe and England at this time. And it's starting right around 1517 and extending all the way up into the 17th century. And this is the time of what is well known as the Protestant Reformation, with Martin Luther is best known for this, nailing his 99 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg on what is now known as Halloween, October 31st. He did this in 1517. Now, people think of this as like him marching up and like saying, I'm out of here, you people are nuts, and you better answer these accusations. He actually was just posting 99 things that he wanted to debate. And he was posting them on the church door because that is, in fact, was the town's bulletin board. There were probably all kinds of other things posted up there, like lost dog and stuff like that. But anyway, this kicked off the Reformation, mostly in the way that the church hierarchy in Rome, the Pope and other senior officials reacted to his posting. They did not like some of the things he was asserting. And one of the major things he was asserting was salvation by your own faith alone, not simply participating in the church's salvific system, which Luther called works, things like veneration of saints and Mary, the use of images and decorations and rites and rituals and confession. Luther was saying that actually you can be saved by your faith in Jesus alone. As time went on and they tried to get him to stop and Luther wouldn't stop and more people got excited about it, he began emphasizing scripture and worship in your local language. Everything had been in Latin up to that point. The desire and desire to have the Bible be of central importance in Christian life. The use of scripture only, sola scriptura, for determining what is the right thing to do, and also a development over time of more congregational forms of authority, basically not the authority flowing out of the hierarchy, but authority flowing from the bottom, from local congregations. These were important aspects of the Protestant Reformation. Now, Henry, it is true. It all gets started because he wants an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. And this is for a variety of reasons, not just because he's, shall we say, interested in Anne Boleyn, but also because he was unable to have a male heir with Catherine of Aragon, and he was very concerned about that. And so really what happened in his thinking and the thinking of other folks in his church had to do with the earthly authority of the church. This makes his reforms and the reforms in England different from the ones in Europe because they weren't really about theology as a whole, or they were more about, or they were, but they were about church theology, ecclesiology. What is the earthly authority of the church? All of us Christians agree that Jesus is the head of the church, but unfortunately, Jesus isn't around to answer a lot of detailed questions about, how you can be baptized and the bylaws you should have in your church. So who's in charge here on earth? And what Henry began thinking when the Pope would not grant him this annulment for various reasons was, actually, I think I'm in charge of the church, that the king is in charge of the church and his kingdom. And he issues this decree in 1534 in what I have misspelled as the Act of Supremacy, which basically said, I'm in charge and all the clergy better go along with this or I will lop off their heads. So most of the clergy went along with this. He makes his first Archbishop of Canterbury under him to be a fellow named Thomas Cranmer. They translate the Bible into English. He dissolves all the monasteries in England to take their money, essentially. So it's not real pretty. He promulgates, finally, by the end of his life, actually it gets published after his death, a Book of Common Prayer in English. This is the first prayer book being used in the church in English so that everybody can understand what's going on. However, at the same time, he continues a lot of things. This is very different from Europe, where a lot of reformers threw out everything that wasn't biblical and original, or they felt was original. Henry really just wanted to be in charge. He didn't want to change the church very much. So he continues the use of bishops, priests, and deacons. He continues to maintain the majority of previous beliefs and practices. This is the beginning of why we look a little bit weird in terms of neither fully looking like a Roman Catholic church nor a very heavily Reformed Protestant church. Now, Henry dies, and he's succeeded by a child that he finally had with his third wife, Jane, or fourth, I can't remember anymore. He ends up with 6 wives. He has it with Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was very Protestant. Edward, his son, was 9 years old at the time that Henry dies. So he can't exactly just take over. So Henry appoints, before he dies, a regency council to kind of run the country until Edward is old enough to take over. And they are very Protestant. This is really interesting. So Henry, who in some ways wasn't super Protestant, he liked a lot of aspects of the Roman Catholic Church, but he appoints, before he dies, a very Protestant regency council. And they start really reforming things. They change the Book of Common Prayer for a new edition in 1551 that is very Protestant. It declares the Eucharist, the communion, is just a memorial. Jesus is not present in the bread and wine. They start going through churches and whacking out the stained glass and destroying the images of saints and stuff. This is not very popular with most people. Imagine someone walking into your church and busting up all of your carefully put together stuff that's very important and meaningful to you. But they did. But here's the funny thing. Edward VI dies early in 1553 after only 5 years. And the reformers aren't able to fully take over, because who takes over? Queen Mary I is the next in line. And she is, guess what, the daughter of his first marriage with Catherine of Aragon. She's been exiled, thrown out, welcomed back in, sort of, kind of not really in the power structure. And she's known as Mary Tudor, and she becomes known as Bloody Mary. She is very Roman Catholic still. She's pissed off. She reinstates the authority of the Pope. She returns to a lot of traditional practices. She burns a lot of Protestant bishops who won't recant, including Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. But here's the thing. She dies after 5 years. So the country is kind of going back to being a very Roman Catholic country, but it never really gets fully settled because she dies in 1558. So then you ask, well, who's in charge now? Well, it's Elizabeth I. And guess who she is? She's the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, his first wife after divorcing Catherine of Aragon. And she is Protestant in her upbringing and beliefs, but she really also is kind of like her dad. She likes a lot of traditional practices. She likes candles, vestments, bishops, priests, deacons. She likes all that stuff. She had a crucifix in her private chapel, which drove a lot of her Protestant bishops nuts. But here's the deal. She lives and reigns for almost 45 years. So she has time to get some stuff settled. And what she establishes is kind of known as the Elizabethan Compromise, which gets immortalized in the 1558 Act of Uniformity, which basically says, look, you have to go to church and you have to use the Book of Common Prayer. But beyond that, you're welcome to whatever belief you want. And she has them put together a new Book of Common Prayer, 1559 edition. In it, it's really interesting. You're allowed to see the Eucharist. It talks about the Eucharist as a sacrament, the bread and wine as being Christ's body and blood. Or maybe it's also a memorial meal. It's both. Now, I always like to say, and a bunch of recent historians like to say, if her compromise was such a great compromise, why were there Puritans? And Puritans, the folks who ended up in the U.S., were Church of England members who felt that Elizabeth wasn't reforming the church enough, wasn't making it Protestant enough. And eventually she kept saying, hey, put up, shut up, be part of us, or leave. And they left. Some of them went to Holland, and some of them went to the U.S. So if every time you have Thanksgiving or someone is giving thanks for Thanksgiving, say, yes, you can thank us. We kicked out the Puritans. Anyway, Mary Elizabeth dies in 1603, having established much of the church, this kind of compromised church, not completely Protestant, not completely Roman Catholic, kind of in the middle. And that explains actually a lot of why our church looks the way it is and why we behave the way we do. Now, here's the deal. After she dies, battles actually continue. The Reformation isn't actually over. So there begin to be battles over aspects of Calvinist theology. Because actually, most of the Church of England was using Calvinism as their theology at this time, but they were getting in debates over different kinds of Calvinism. They were getting over debates over whether the altar should be up against the wall or whether it should be out like a table. This goes back and forth and ultimately ends up with the English Civil War, if you've heard of that. I mean, church and state were not separate, and there was other stuff going on that caused the English Civil War, but religious controversies were part of that. Archbishop William Laud, who was actually very high church, very Roman Catholic in his preferences, they wind up beheading him. And then get this, they behead the king, Charles I, which is really kind of, if you know about the importance of kings in England, it's sort of amazing that people rose up and beheaded their own king. And now we enter a really weird period in Church of England history. The bishops kind of disappear. They start using a very strange prayer book, but there's people who definitely know how to do things the way they'd always been done. And this goes on until actually everybody gets tired of things and calls for a monarch to come back. Charles II, who comes back in 1660 and really institutes, the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer of 1662, which is still the official Book of Common Prayer in England, and things finally settle down. The aftermath of all of this back and forth, Protestant, Roman Catholic, Protestant, images, no images, altar up against the wall, altar not up against the wall, is a very distinct looking church and a distinctly behaving church. So really what happened is this strong concept that the authority, earthly authority, is vested in each national church, not at the level of the individual parish or individual church or congregation, but the national church. A lot of traditions from the earlier period were retained, so that's why you'll see people crossing themselves, kneeling, genuflecting, but a lot of diversity in use. Elizabeth allowed a lot of that diversity as long as you showed up in church and used the Book of Common Prayer. And that diversity included a lot of our theological diversity that you see, because Elizabeth and later reformers said, hey, you know what, except for certain things like the creeds and other kind of basic Christian stuff, you know what, you can have a lot of different ideas and still be a member of our church. Importantly, the Book of Common Prayer became this central document, besides the Bible, the central document that holds us all together. And that is why Episcopalians and Church of England people and Anglicans throughout the world love their Book of Common Prayer and don't change it very easily, and find the prayers and worship that it prescribes to be extremely important. And it's not just for any old reason. It's because that's what holds us together, is prayer and common prayer, more than beliefs or doctrines or creeds or things like that. It's our way we pray together. And that goes all the way back to Elizabeth saying, look, I don't really care what you believe in your head, just come to church. You have to come to church and use this book, period. Now, we also developed in this time, and I haven't had enough time to really talk about this, a very particular way of doing biblical interpretation, which is sometimes called the three-legged stool, where Scripture is still central, but we understand that Scripture is difficult to interpret, and you have to use traditions, which can be everything from prayers to hymns to other theologians to traditional beliefs and practices, as well as your own God-given reason, the way you think. This was an idea developed originally by a theologian and bishop named Richard Hooker, who lived during Elizabeth I's reign. He never used the term three-legged stool, but it comes out of his work, and it comes out of his arguments against the Puritans, who kept saying, look, just read the Bible, that'll tell you what to do. And Hooker was like, it's not that easy to read the Bible and figure out what to do on every single question, like, should we have candles on the altar or not? The Bible doesn't say anything about that. So we have to use all three of these to make our arguments. And that remains very much part of our distinctiveness is that we do interpretation that way. Now, notably, a lot of theology right after, say, right by the 17th century was still very Calvinist, and a lot of decorations, investments, and things were kind of minimal in our churches, but they have come back into greater use because they were never really forbidden. And that actually ties into some more history. So as time goes on, the church continues to evolve and change, and you have what's called the Oxford movement, which began in the 1830s in England. It actually was kicked off because Parliament in England decided to pick a bishop, and the church church hierarchy lost its happiness, shall we say. They got really freaked out, thought that the church was getting really tainted by secular society, so they wanted to return the Church of England to what they thought of as the original church, with an emphasis on sacraments, a return of many practices like kneeling, crossing yourself, a renewed emphasis on veneration of the saints and Mary, a real interest in citation of what they called the church fathers, which is sort of the earliest bishops and monks of the church who wrote in the 2nd century, maybe the 3rd and 4th century. And a lot of what they brought back were a lot of practices that were called at the time very popish, too Roman Catholic for many people. But they restored a lot of things that make us look very Roman Catholic to this day. And they wound up, even though a lot of people were very annoyed with them, they wound up having huge influence. They influenced another society called the Cambridge Camden Society, which influenced church architecture, brought back things like stained glass, and really the way Trinity looks today is we are an Oxford movement church with a kind of Cambridge Camden Society architecture. And it also kind of solidified what to this day is kind of a way of distinguishing different Anglican and Episcopal churches in terms of high or low church. And what we mean by that is, do we use a lot of ritual and liturgical practices that look older, that look maybe what you might call Roman Catholic, or not? There are other Episcopal and Anglican churches that really don't. They're not going to have candles on the altar. They might use minimal vestments and minimal decoration. Sometimes this is also described as Anglo-Catholic versus Evangelical. And that kind of sounds like what it means. The Anglo-Catholics like to use a lot more things that might be seen as Roman Catholic in practice. Evangelicals don't like to use that stuff as much. All of these churches are legitimately Episcopalian or Church of England churches. We talk to each other, we get along just fine, but we worship in different ways and our churches look differently. But we all still recognize each other as being members of the same church. So that's an interesting part of our diversity. We've never demanded complete uniformity across the entire church. Now, how does the Episcopal Church end up here created? The Episcopal Church is basically the U.S. branch of the Church of England. So during the colonial period in the U.S., not the first, but some of the most important show up in 1607, landing at Jamestown. And guess what? This crowd that lands has a Church of England priest with them. And the first thing they do is have a Church of England service. So this is in Virginia. This is sort of the birth of what came to be Episcopalians, because later, actually earlier, Puritans had already begun showing up. Later Puritans show up. They settle other parts of the East Coast and New England. They turn eventually into Baptists. But the Episcopal Church descends from formal, full-on Church of England folks showing up with settlers here at Jamestown and then spreading throughout Virginia and other areas. What happens is there's some problems after the U.S. Revolution. So up to the U.S. Revolution in 1776 and beyond, 1789, is when it kind of finally plays out. Anglican church, the people who were worshiping in this way were just Anglicans in the U.S. A weird thing is that England never sent over any bishops. So if you wanted to be ordained as a priest, you had to get on a boat, go to England, be ordained, and then come back. They never sent bishops. This is very odd. And then after we have our revolution, one of the problems is the Book of Common Prayer we were using included prayers for the king and queen or queen of England. This is problematic for a new country that's free, and also it's problematic. We need some bishops. So the church has to kind of reorganize. And so it begins to reorganize with a first convention, General Convention as it was called, in 1789. We put together a new Book of Common Prayer, which is essentially the same as the one in England, not quite, but very similar. And we send this guy, Samuel Seabury, over to England to get ordained as a bishop. And actually, the bishops in England are willing to do that, but they want him to swear fealty to the king. And he can't really do that in good conscience. So he goes up to Scotland, where there were a bunch of bishops who earlier on had separated from the hierarchy in England for different reasons, but were still bishops in line in apostolic succession, connected to all the bishops earlier. And they said, all right, we'll ordain you a bishop without requiring you to swear any allegiance to any king, but we would like you to use some aspects of our Book of Common Prayer in yours. So he does this. He becomes the first U.S. bishop. And some of our Book of Common Prayer, our first Book of Common Prayer, was influenced by the Scottish Episcopal Church. Later on, two more priests go over. William White and Samuel Provost go over. And at this point, the church in England has said, oh, to heck with it. We'll ordain you. You don't have to swear fealty to the king. They get ordained. Now we have three bishops. You need three bishops to make another bishop. We are off and running. And so now you have and we call ourselves the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States. Episcopal comes from the Greek word episkopos, meaning bishop. So it shows you how important bishops are to our church. But we identify ourselves as Protestant, and we retain a lot of ties to the Church of England. By the time of William White and Samuel Provost, all the hard feelings had been forgotten, and we have a lot of ties. However, the Church of England and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the head of that church, is not in charge of us. We have charge of our own church. So let's take it from then till now, real fast. There was a sad and unfortunate split within the Episcopal Church during the Civil War. The southern portion of the Episcopal Church was still in favor of slavery. It is a shameful part of us that we were not unified in that regard. However, after the Civil War, we did reunite. We currently have 110 dioceses. Each diocese has its own bishop. We have approximately 6,500 parishes and more or less 1 million members. Now, what's interesting is churches in Colombia, the Dominican Republic, all of that list there are actually part of the Episcopal Church, and they descend from missionaries that we've sent out. And as I mentioned, we have high and low church dioceses and high and low church parishes. So there's still been a lot of evolution and difference. And we are part of the Anglican Communion. So we are part of a larger group of churches that descend from the Church of England, mostly churches that originate in English colonies, in Africa, in parts of Southeast Asia. However, it's different. Churches in Mexico and in India actually petitioned to become part of our communion. What holds us together is a very similar worship. Our books of common prayer are very similar, and also our common tradition, but no one church can tell the other what to do in each nation and each province of the Anglican Communion. So here we are. If you were live, you would be able to have questions. I'm showing a picture of the Washington National Cathedral in the US, and the reason Darth Vader is in there pointing up at that beautiful stained glass image of creation, which actually has a tiny piece of the moon in that central dot that you see in the middle of that big black void. But if you look to the right under questions, you see that one of the gargoyles on the Washington National Cathedral is Darth Vader. So we're a funny bunch. We don't take ourselves too terribly seriously all the time, even though we do take our love of God and each other very seriously, and our love of our church and our faith very seriously. But we can have a good laugh at ourselves every now and then, because what better gargoyle than Darth Vader? So I hope you've enjoyed this. Certainly, if you've watched it and have questions, let me know. Send me an email, and I hope this helps you understand a little bit more of our history and why we look the way we do. Take care. Love you. Bye-bye.